The story follows a nameless cleaning woman, a silent shadow who tidies up after hours, but what they don't know is that she's the heiress to a billion-dollar empire. For 2 weeks, she lives undercover, enduring contempt and cruelty. And she doesn't just mop the floors, she scrubs away the false mask of a decaying system. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the transparent glass, casting long shadows across the marble floor of the villa perched atop Hillcrest Hill. Below, the city sprawled like a miniature map, shrinking beneath their feet. But inside that room, time seemed to freeze with a single, seemingly simple statement. "You're not truly ready to take over," Robert Williams said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Jasmine pause mid-motion as she reached for her glass of wine. She looked at her father, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man she admired, loved, and once thought she understood better than anyone. But for the first time in years, Jasmine felt as though she'd taken a step back from him. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I've worked tirelessly for 6 years. I've led $3 billion projects. I'm the only one on the board with an MBA from Harvard and real-world experience. What more do I lack?" Robert set his glass down on the walnut table, the light reflecting off its rim. "You know everything, from the top," he replied slowly. "But you've never known this company from the bottom." "The bottom?" Jasmine frowned. "You mean the workers? Janitors, security guards, receptionists, the packaging team, the people who never step into a boardroom but keep the company's wheels turning every single day?" She let out a laugh, short and slightly forced. "You think I'm not humble enough?" "No." Robert shook his head, his gaze growing distant, as if he were looking back to the days of starting out in a cramped garage. "When I began, I did everything. Mopped floors, assembled equipment, pitched to investors. I know what it's like to be overlooked, to be treated as if I didn't exist. And because of that, I understood every cell of this company." Jasmine sat in silence for a moment, her hand unconsciously tightening around her glass. She'd never seen her father this serious before. "You're the one I trust the most," Robert continued, his voice lower now. "But if you take over without knowing how things really work, you'll be deceived by flatterers. You won't spot the ones sabotaging from within, and you won't know how to protect the vulnerable. Because you've never been one of them." The air in the room grew thick, as if something invisible had just been laid bare. "So, what do you want me to do?" Jasmine asked, deliberately slow. "Go out into the field? Visit the factory?" "No," Robert replied, his eyes never leaving hers. "I want you to work, as a janitor, for 2 weeks, night shift, anonymous, no privileges, no support devices. Experience it as an unknown employee with no one knowing who you are." Jasmine froze. "Are you serious?" She let out a laugh, this time sharper, almost uncontrollable. "I'm the executive vice president. My name's been in Forbes, and you want me to wield a mop?" Robert merely nodded, saying nothing more. A silence settled between father and daughter, deep and vast, like an abyss. In Jasmine's mind, 100 reactions flared: anger, hurt, shame, helplessness. But amid it all, there was a spark of challenge. No one, not even her father, could question her ability without being proven wrong. "Fine," she said. Her voice was harder than the granite flooring beneath them. "I'll do it. I'll step down to the bottom of the company you built, and when I come back, no one will dare question me again." Their gazes locked, not as father and daughter, but as 2 generations of leaders sealing a silent pact. Robert gave a slight nod, a flicker of unconcealed pride in his eyes. "You'll learn more from a bucket of water and a mop," he said softly, "than from any lecture at Harvard." Jasmine stood, turning toward the door, but as her hand touched the knob, she paused. "Dad," she said, glancing back, her lips curving into a cryptic smile, "are you sure you're ready to see your company in a different light?" Robert looked at his daughter, no longer the clever little girl of years past, but a grown woman about to step into the invisible world where power couldn't shield anyone. "I'll learn again too," he said, "with you." And the door clicked shut behind Jasmine, marking the start of 2 weeks that would change her life and the future of Williams Innovations forever. The glass reflected a stranger's face in a silent gray uniform. Jasmine stared at her own reflection. No lipstick, no designer glasses, no meticulously tailored suit measured to the millimeter, just curly hair tied neatly under a plain headscarf and a plastic name tag bearing the cold, printed words, "Janet, Cleaning Crew." She barely recognized herself. The 38th floor hallway of Williams Innovations headquarters at night was eerily empty. Jasmine's first steps across the marble floor made no sound. She surprised herself by instinctively stepping lighter, as if her body understood it was entering a world where presence was meant to be as invisible as possible. "Janet, you the new one?" A voice barked from behind, gruff and devoid of any greeting. Jasmine turned. A man stood there, clipboard in hand, his face hard as stone. "I'm Marcus, night supervisor. Here's your list of areas." He shoved a stack of papers at her, then turned away without waiting for a response. "Tools are at the end of the hall. Don't drop anything." "Welcome to the invisible class." The cart was loaded with cleaning sprays, mops, rubber gloves, trash bags. Jasmine touched the handle, her fingers, once accustomed to swiping touchscreens and signing million-dollar deals, now forced to grip rough, dusty plastic. She began her work like any other Janet, sweeping, wiping, emptying trash, rolling the cart through silent hallways. No one spoke to her, no one smiled, no one truly looked at her. At first, Jasmine thought it might just be habit. People were busy, focused, but then it hit her. They weren't avoiding her because they were occupied. They did it because she didn't exist to them. A pair in suits brushed past her in the hallway, chatting animatedly. One of them even bumped her cart, knocking over a bottle of floor cleaner. Neither stopped. Neither apologized. Jasmine bent down to pick it up, her hands trembling slightly. No emotions, no anger. "This is the experience," she repeated to herself like a mantra. The first room she cleaned was a small meeting room, a place where she'd once sat, leading countless strategy discussions. Now she crouched beneath that same table, scrubbing dried coffee stains no one had bothered to wipe away. Just as she finished, footsteps echoed behind her, heavy and steady, like a drumbeat of warning. "What are you doing here?" a cold male voice demanded. Jasmine turned, her heart skipping a beat for a moment. Gerald Hayes, operations supervisor, a man who'd sat in the same meeting rooms as her but rarely looked her in the eye when speaking, and now he looked at her like she was a stain. "This room's not clean. What kind of wiping is this?" Gerald bent down, dragging a pale finger along the table's edge where she'd just cleaned, and held it up. "See? Dust. This is Williams Innovations, not some train station break room. Sorry." "I'll wipe it again," Jasmine said quietly, her voice oddly calm. But Gerald didn't leave. He stood there, arms crossed, watching her bend down to scrub the table again, his gaze like a jailer inspecting a prisoner. Jasmine felt layers of dignity being stripped away, bit by bit, yet still. She bowed her head, kept going. By midnight her hands stung from the chemicals. The gloves weren't thick enough. Fingers that had only known keyboards and contract approvals were now peeling and raw. Her back and shoulders ached from constant bending. The sharp smell of disinfectant made her dizzy. In the women's restroom on the 41st floor, Jasmine stood staring at herself in the mirror. Sweat, chemical fumes, disheveled hair, her face, once photographed for magazine covers, now reflected a completely different woman, not because of her appearance, but because of her eyes, tired and, for a fleeting moment, helpless. That's when she overheard the conversation from just outside the door. "That new lady looks so clueless. She's slow at everything. No idea where the company dug her up. Whatever, as long as she cleans for us, it's fine. Who cares? Those people don't have brains anyway. Two voices giggled, then the door opened and shut again. Jasmine stood still. Her breathing quickened. Her fingers unconsciously gripped the edge of the sink. She didn't know the names of those two, but clearly, they didn't need to know hers. To them, she wasn't a person. She was that lady. An indistinct blur in the glossy backdrop of the company headquarters. When her shift ended at 5 a.m., Jasmine stepped out of the building into the faint light of dawn. The early breeze cut through her faded gray uniform, colder than the indifference she'd endured for the past 7 hours. She tilted her head up, gazing at the glass tower stretching into the sky. Before, it had been a symbol of dreams. Today, it was the fortress of a glittering, ruthless world, and she had just passed through the first gate into its deepest depths. The third day, as Janet began with the sharp sting of chemicals and a dull ache in her left shoulder. Jasmine had learned to shift the mop's weight to ease her back, but no technique could lessen the pain of being treated like dirt. She was wiping down the hallway leading to the executive offices when Gerald Hayes appeared again, like a sleepless specter. He wore the same crisp white shirt, a pale gray tie, and clutched a brown leather briefcase as if it were an extension of his authority. His eyes scanned the floor quickly, hunting for something to criticize. "Still dirty," he said coldly. Jasmine looked up, startled. "I just finished wiping." "And you did a terrible job." Jerem cut her off, nudging her water bucket with his foot, sending ripples sloshing near the rim. "I've told you before, the standard here is perfection, not good enough." Jasmine bowed her head, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I'll wipe it again, sir." "No, sir." "I want results, not politeness," he snapped, then walked off, his shoes leaving a clear smudge on the very section she'd just scrubbed. She gripped the mop handle tighter. With every swipe to erase his footprint, it felt like she was wiping away her own dignity. That same day, Jasmine was assigned to clean Derek Phillips' office, the marketing director famous for his vintage watch collection and an ego bigger than the company boardroom. The room was nearly spotless, but as Jasmine reached for the broom, Derek looked up from his screen with a greasy half-smile. "Oh, you're just in time. We were brainstorming today, so it's a bit messy," he said, arms crossed, leaning back as if watching a performance for his amusement. Jasmine glanced around. A few coffee cups, some crumpled papers, a slightly tilted plant, nothing resembling chaos. "You know," Derek continued as she wiped the desk, "people usually clean glass in circles, not straight lines." Jasmine paused. "I think both work depending on—" "No," he interrupted, standing and snatching the spray bottle from her hand. "I'll show you how it's done right." She stood there, watching him wipe the same spot she'd just cleaned as if proving a point. When he handed the bottle back, he smirked. "Try again. Proper technique this time." Jasmine bowed her head and wiped again. Once, then again. Then a third time when he ran his hand along the desk's edge and discovered an imaginary smudge. And then, at 11 p.m., he glanced at his watch and said, "You know, I still smell a bit of that harsh chemical. Are you using the right stuff?" Jasmine left the room near the end of her shift, her body exhausted, the time to clean her remaining areas squeezed into a suffocating rush. Derek had taken up nearly 3 hours of her night for a room that was practically clean to begin with, the 5th night. Jasmine entered the meeting room on the 38th floor, right on her schedule, but before she could set the mop down, a voice sharp as a blade sliced through the air. "Where do you think you're going?" Jasmine turned. Veronica Wells, vice president of sales, stood there, her red dress hugging her figure, her eyes brimming with authority and contempt. "I'm just following the cleaning schedule, ma'am," Jasmine replied. "I'm in a meeting, and you're interrupting. Do you even understand the concept of manners, or do people like you only know how to hold a broom?" Jasmine stepped back. "I'm sorry, I can come back later." "No!" Veronica advanced, her eyes blazing with anger. "You'll clean now, and quietly. I don't pay to hear janitors make excuses." Jasmine gripped the mop handle, head lowered. But as she moved toward the meeting table, Veronica suddenly swept her arm, striking Jasmine's shoulder hard enough to nearly knock her over. "Don't turn your back when I'm talking to you," Veronica shouted, her voice echoing through the glass-walled room. Silence. A group of young employees sitting inside witnessed it all. No one spoke. No one intervened. They buried their faces in their laptops, as if the humiliation had never happened. Inside Jasmine, something cracked. Not from the blow, but from the complicit silence. That night she sat alone in the cleaning staff locker room, staring into the vague darkness ahead. Gerald, Derek, Veronica. 3 faces, 3 types of power, 3 flavors of cruelty. But they shared one trait. None of them saw her as human. At this point, the challenge was no longer just about understanding company culture. She was beginning to see the fissures, corroding the glossy glass walls from within. She didn't yet know what she'd do next, but for the first time, the concept of justice took shape in her heart, not for herself, but for all those who wore headscarves and pushed cleaning carts through the shadows. The 7th night, the shift began with the soft patter of rain against the 42nd-meter floor windows, the only sound that made Jasmine feel she still existed in this world. 7 days under the guise of Janet had stripped away nearly everything that once defined the powerful Jasmine Williams. Her aura, her confidence, even her faith in human decency. She was cleaning the large meeting room, the one named after her father, the Robert Williams. The irony wasn't lost on her. Now she wasn't even allowed to touch that nameplate with her bare hands. The floor-to-ceiling glass reflected a figure mopping the floor, head bowed low, face hidden behind disheveled curls, hands in worn gloves, back slightly hunched from exhaustion. She stared at that reflection and wondered, how many people have watched themselves disappear? The sharp click of high heels echoed behind her, crisp, deliberate, each step like a knife tapping the marble floor. She didn't have time to turn before the familiar voice rang out. "You're here again." Jasmine turned. Veronica Wells stood in the doorway, phone in hand, her gaze sweeping over Janet as if spotting an unscrubbed stain. "The cleaning schedule lists this room at 9:30, Jasmine said, keeping her tone soft. "Schedule? Are you trying to lecture me about schedules in my own meeting room?" Veronica advanced, each step carrying the weight of an unspoken storm. "No, Jasmine stepped back. Veronica thrust a finger in her face. "Do you know who I was meeting with today? You just interrupted a presentation with international partners worth over $40 million. There was no one in the room when I came in," Jasmine said quietly. "What?" Veronica's eyes narrowed. "I checked before entering. The room was empty. I didn't hear any meeting." The air grew heavy. For a few seconds, they stood still, one clinging to reason, the other losing control. Then, slap. The sound cracked through the quiet glass room like a gunshot. The blow landed suddenly, sharp and fierce, a blade slicing across Jasmine's left cheek. She froze, head turned to the side, eyes wide. Not from pain, but from shock. Veronica stood there, hand still raised, her gaze icy and unrepentant. "Don't ever talk back to me. Don't think you get to argue with your superiors just because you can mop a floor," she said, her voice like frozen steel. "What are you here?" "Nothing." Jasmine said nothing. No anger, no resistance. She just stood there, cheek still flushed red, her eyes alight, not with the spark of someone insulted, but of someone waking up. She glanced around. Through the transparent glass, a few sales team employees stood frozen, having witnessed it all. No one stepped in. No one spoke. A young woman ducked her head, hands trembling as she flipped through her notebook. Another hurriedly pretended to make a call. They all saw. They all stayed silent. Jasmine bent down, picked up the fallen mop and resumed, wiping, as if the slap had never happened. But in her mind, a switch had flipped. That night, in the dim supply closet where plastic buckets and worn gloves lay scattered, Jasmine sat alone. The faint yellow glow of the fluorescent bulb overhead made the space feel even more claustrophobic. Her cheek still tingled where Veronica had struck, but inside, a fire was starting to blaze. She pulled out her phone, an old device she'd used to conceal her identity. On the screen, a folder labeled Janet Files slowly opened. Inside, a collection of audio clips, photos, and covert videos from the past days came into view. Gerald berating her in the hallway, splashing water on her, then walking off without an apology. Derek forcing her to re-clean his office 3 times for absurd reasons. Karen, the HR director, smiling as she casually remarked, "Janitors shouldn't expect to be treated like real employees." And now Veronica. The slap. She lightly tapped the screen, pausing on one frame. Veronica mid-swing, her face tilted sharply to the side, eyes wide, hair flung askew. Jasmine stared at that image for a long time. Then she pressed save. As she stepped out of the headquarters at 5 a.m., the rain had stopped. The city still slept. But Jasmine didn't. She looked up at the Williams Innovations building, the place bearing her father's name, the embodiment of his lifelong dream. Now she saw something rotting within it, and it was time someone cleaned it up for real. Not with a mop, not with disinfectant, but with justice. Jasmine stood before a frosted glass door bearing the inscription, "Karen Mitchell, Director of Human Resources, Your Voice Matters." Just below was a tiny rainbow sticker, next to bold, friendly capital letters, "Safe Space, a Safe Place." She pressed her lips together. The word safe suddenly sounded like a bitter joke. This wasn't the first time she'd heard of Karen. On internal records, Karen was the champion of humanistic values, the organizer of diversity and inclusion workshops. In PR campaigns, she was the face of the company's positive culture, and in the hallways her image graced posters plastered across the building with the slogan, "Speaking up is the first step to change." Today, Jasmine wanted to test if anyone was truly listening. Lunch break. Karen sat alone in her office, holding a teacup, her hair neatly pinned up, makeup subtle, the epitome of a professional mother vibe. When Jasmine knocked, Karen looked up with a practiced smile. "Hello," she said, her eyes trained to carry a hint of empathy. "You're one of the new staff, right? Please, sit." Jasmine nodded and took the seat across the desk. Her body tensed slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't Janet begging for pity. This was Jasmine Williams testing the authenticity of the system. "I have something I'd like to report," she said, her voice low. "Of course, feel free. No one's judged here." 3 minutes later, the comfort Karen promised evaporated. Jasmine recounted Gerald dumping water on her, Veronica slapping her in front of colleagues. She described how Derek manipulated her work hours and how every word, gesture, and glance in this company carried the same message: "You're not human." Karen didn't take notes. She just nodded faintly, tilting her head in that rehearsed way people do when they've been trained to look like they're listening. When Jasmine paused, Karen sighed, placing a hand over hers. A gesture both comforting and dismissive, like wrapping up a story. "First of all," she said in a gentle tone, "thank you for sharing. I know it's not easy to speak about these things. You're very brave." Jasmine tightened her grip on her knee, waiting for the next part. The action, the investigation, the justice, but it never came. However, Karen continued, pulling her hand back, her smile unwavering. In a big company like this, there will always be differences in management styles. Gerald can be a bit blunt, and Veronica's known for her perfectionism. Jasmine frowned. "You call a slap perfectionism?" Karen tilted her head again. "I'm not saying it's right, it's just, from their perspective, there can be misunderstandings sometimes, and you've only been here a few days. Their behavior might not have been ideal, but it's not necessarily intentional harm." Jasmine stiffened. She realized Karen's tone had shifted, not soft anymore, but cautious, like someone diffusing a minefield. "I get it," Karen went on. "As a janitor, it's real to feel overlooked sometimes. But in this company, what matters is knowing your role and doing well within that framework." In that moment, Jasmine stopped hearing. All sound sank to a low hum, drowned out by the emptiness swelling in her chest. Knowing your role, doing well within that framework. So safety here was only for those who stayed quiet? Karen stood, signaling the conversation was over. My advice? Focus on your work, avoid friction, and don't let small things throw you off. In a professional environment, growing a thick skin is a survival skill. Jasmine left the office in silence. The empty hallway stretched before her. The "Your Voice Matters" poster by the door, now a cruel mockery. She stepped into the changing room, shut the door, and leaned against the wall. She didn't cry, not a single tear. Instead, she pulled out her phone and opened the recording app. The entire conversation with Karen, from the sugary opening to the cold, excusing finale, was captured clearly, neatly stored. She added a note: the false wall the system knows but chooses to ignore. That evening, while wiping down the hallway to the executive floor, Jasmine paused before a large wall-mount mirror. The overhead lights cast her shadow long across the floor. A week ago, she'd walked these halls as a future leader. Now she scrubbed the floors beneath the feet of people who'd never remember her face. But that no longer scared her, because now she knew the system's true face, and she didn't want its approval anymore. She wanted to dismantle it. Friday. The city basked in a golden afternoon, sunlight piercing through the towering glass buildings, tracing new edges around the bastions of assumed power. But for Jasmine Williams, today wasn't just the end of a week. It was the night before the storm. She stood on the top level of the underground parking garage, quietly changing back into her old clothes, a worn shirt, a faded headscarf, dust-stained sneakers. Janet would make one final appearance, and this time not to endure, but to set a trap. That evening she followed her assigned schedule, cleaning the boardroom hallway ahead of an emergency meeting the next morning. The building was strangely quiet. Only the rhythmic squeak of the mop against the tiles and the steady thud of her heartbeat, like war drums, filled the air. Everything had been meticulously planned: audio recordings, videos, internal emails, evidence of misappropriated employee welfare funds, and the HR department's hollow responses, all extracted, organized, and stored on an encrypted USB drive. She'd also sent a backup to a secure location, just in case. Robert, her father, had agreed to call an emergency meeting with the entire leadership team and board of directors. At Jasmine's request, he didn't disclose the true reason. His email was curt: tomorrow 10 a.m. main boardroom, serious issue requiring immediate attention. All senior leadership mandatory, no absences. She knew that exposing the architects of this invisible wall of cruelty would take more than a report. It demanded a direct blow to their awareness, a shock powerful enough to shatter the frosted glass of their pretense. At 11 p.m., Gerald Hayes appeared again, as if fate itself wanted the final act to be complete. "You're cleaning the boardroom again?" he asked, his tone half mocking, half threatening. "It's assigned," Jasmine replied, her eyes fixed on the mop. Gerald strode forward, stepping deliberately across the freshly cleaned floor, leaving wet shoe prints behind. "Make sure there's not a single speck by morning, got it? The board will be sitting here if anything's less than perfect." He leaned in close, whispering, "I'll personally fire you." Jasmine looked up at him, not with fear, but with an icy calm that defied explanation. "Yes, I understand," she said, her voice light, almost like a farewell. Gerald smirked, oblivious that each step he took across that floor was marking the final traces of his own career. 2 a.m. Jasmine stood in the changing room, facing the mirror. She slowly removed the headscarf, revealing her curls, freshly styled and voluminous once more. From a small bag, she pulled out a case containing real glasses, not the nameless plastic frames Janet had worn. She didn't need to dress up as Jasmine Williams. She was Jasmine Williams. She'd never left. The world just hadn't seen her when she stepped down below. 6 a.m. She called her father. Robert answered with a long exhale. "Ready?" Ready, Jasmine replied, her gaze lifting to the building's upper floors, now glowing in the dawn light. Today changes everything. This company. It's carried your name, she added softly. But tomorrow, I'll make it worthy of our family's legacy. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm proud you've endured the pain without breaking, and tomorrow I'll stand beside you. 8:45 a.m. The senior leadership began to arrive. Expensive suits, designer ties, the same cold stares as always. Gerald entered first. He scanned the room, inspecting the table, wiping the leather chairs again, muttering to his assistant, What's this about today? Veronica Wells, cool and commanding, stood with arms crossed, a faint smirk on her lips. Derek Phillips clutched his laptop case, chewing gum, his eyes distracted. Karen Mitchell from HR arrived last, still wearing the friendly smile from her wall posters. No one noticed the janitor tidying a far corner, mop propped against the wall, head bowed low. No one saw that those hands no longer trembled. 9:59 a.m. Jasmine stood behind the boardroom door. Outside was a company rotting from within. Inside, the truth waited to be unleashed. She took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. 10 a.m. sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling of the 42nd floor boardroom, bathing the polished walnut table where the entire Williams Innovations leadership sat in silence. The air was so still that the faint hum of the hidden air conditioner overhead became audible. Robert Williams, with his silver hair and seasoned gaze, sat at the head of the table, hands clasped in front of him, his expression contemplative. Beside him was an empty chair. That chair had once belonged to Jasmine Williams, and today it would belong to someone else. Gerald Hayes glanced at his watch, muttering, They called it an emergency meeting and it still hasn't started. Veronica stifled a yawn behind a bejeweled hand. What's so earth-shattering today? I've got a client meeting at 11. Derek Phillips scrolled through his phone, smirking with casual confidence. Karen Mitchell, seated farther down, maintained her professional demeanor, notebook in hand, poised to record. No one paid attention to the woman in the janitor's uniform, clearing coffee cups from the table. Her movements swift, eyes lowered, blending into the background as if invisibility were second nature. Robert stood, tapping a finger lightly on the table. Thank you all for being here. This meeting was called because I've received information that forces me to question the core values we stand for. No one spoke. Gerald leaned back, arms crossed. Over his chest, Robert continued, I've learned that a member of this organization has witnessed and personally experienced clear signs of power corruption, a decline in managerial ethics, and the rot of our corporate culture from within. A snort escaped Veronica. Here we go with the idealism again. Robert glanced at her, unfazed. That member is here with us now. The room stirred. All eyes turned to the woman standing at the far end, beside the cleaning cart. Jasmine looked up, slowly, deliberately. She stepped toward the table, where Gerald furrowed his brow. Veronica arched an eyebrow, and Derek still hadn't caught on. She straightened, her shoulders no longer slumped like a janitor's. She peeled off her gloves. She removed the headscarf. The fake glasses gave way to a sleek, assertive pair. Real ones. Finally, she unzipped the uniform. Beneath it was a perfectly tailored blazer and an ivory blouse. Elegant, decisive, radiating authority. No introduction was needed. That silent transformation alone sucked the air from the room. Good morning, Jasmine said, her voice ringing clear, sharp as a honed blade. Gerald stammered, You're... Jasmine Williams, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Daughter of the founder, executive vice president, and the successor to the CEO position. No one could speak. For the past 2 weeks, Jasmine went on, I've lived as a janitor in this company. I've been humiliated, slapped, had water dumped on me. I've been dismissed, degraded. And the worst part wasn't the actions themselves. It was the complicit silence from the system itself. She opened a laptop on the table. With one click, the large screen behind her flared to life. The video began, Gerald splashing water on her, crisp, time-stamped, with sound, Derek, forcing her to clean his office 3 times, then deliberately spilling paper scraps on the floor, Veronica slapping her mid-meeting, her gaze dripping with contempt, and finally, Karen's voice, "In your position, you should know your place." Silence. Shock. Some looked away. Others gaped. Karen paled, her hands clenching, her notebook tumbling to the floor. Jasmine met their eyes, one by one. "This isn't personal anymore. This is the culture you've built, an environment where dignity is disposable unless it comes with a title or status." Robert stood, stepping beside his daughter. "I asked Jasmine to do this, but I never imagined the truth would be this harsh." He turned to Gerald, Veronica, Karen, Derek. "I placed my trust in you, but what I got back was a company I don't recognize, a place where, if I were starting over, I wouldn't survive." The meeting didn't end with applause, but with a decisive verdict. All those involved immediately terminated. Evidence was submitted to the Internal Oversight Board and legal team. The HR department would be fully restructured. An independent investigation was launched at once. Jasmine didn't celebrate. She quietly left the room, passing the familiar cleaning cart, brushing it lightly, like bidding farewell to a chapter of her life. At that moment, a young janitor dressed in the same uniform she'd worn a week ago looked at her with wide-eyed astonishment. Jasmine only smiled. "Don't let anyone define your worth. They don't see you doesn't mean you don't exist." And then she walked away, not just as the new CEO, but as the one who'd reawakened the dormant soul of an entire company.